Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Stand by for fireworks, because we'll be talking to Michael Yardley, weapons expert, crack investigative reporter, about JFK. And in the second half of the show, which will be much watched by number 10 Downing Street, with the man who should have been the British Prime Minister, the Right Honourable David Davis, PC MP. Because this is the 50th anniversary weekend of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, the 35th and arguably the best president of the United States, murdered in Technicolor in Dallas, Texas, where a cloud of conspiracy has lingered ever since. At the start, that cloud was no bigger than a man's hand. The strange presence of the then CIA agent George Bush I, later to head the agency, become the president himself, and father, unarguably the worst president of them all. Inexplicably, Bush I was in Dallas on unexplained business, leaving on the last plane before President Kennedy arrived. But this cloud was a harbinger of great storms to come. Now almost nobody believes that which in the beginning only the conspiracy theorists disbelieved. The official story that President Kennedy was killed by a lone gunman with dodgy, if one-sided, Russian and Cuban connections. But if almost everyone now agrees that the official story is bunkum, nobody can quite agree on what the real story might be.
Well, see, the majority of Americans, they don't believe in conspiracy theories about JFK, 9/11, or UFOs for that matter. But they don't trust the government stories either. As Slate.com puts it, most Americans are skeptics, not conspiracists.
Including the Kennedy family, no?
Well, the Kennedys naturally don't believe the official line. Robert Kennedy Jr. gave for the very first time earlier this year an interview on radio in Dallas where he said that he does not believe Oswald was the sole gunman. His father, he said about the Warren Commission report that it was just a shoddy piece of craftsmanship, and therefore he had a private investigation running on the murder of his brother, and he believed that the mafia was heavily involved in it.
Well, the mafia is one of the main conspiracy theories. The current zeitgeist points more in the direction of the military-industrial complex, which is actually where your country comes in, because the relationship between the Kennedys, both of them, and Sukarno, the great independence leader, the nationalist, first president of Indonesia, the military-industrial complex didn't want an Indonesia run by someone like Sukarno, a non-aligned leader.
He was a nationalist, he was a non-aligned leader. He had the conference in Bandung with all the newly independent countries.
They preferred the Indonesia that came after the US-inspired overthrow of Sukarno. He was, of course, Kennedy, very important to people like me of Irish Catholic background. We had only 2 photographs of strangers in our house. One of them was the Pope, and the other was John F. Kennedy, the first and only Catholic president, which is probably why they killed him. But that's another conspiracy theory. Well, my memories of John F. Kennedy are fond ones. You took the camera out around London. What did they think of him?
Mainly fondly, but there were also some who remembered the more scandalous side of the Kennedy dynasty.
He was probably the most iconic president that will ever have lived and ever has lived.
I think he's much mythologized. His father was a gangster who more or less bought him the presidency.
I believe heavily in a conspiracy theory.
Do you? Why?
Because I like my conspiracies.
You like it?
Yeah. I think everything's a conspiracy.
I actually do think V.R.E. Oswald was the only person that was involved in it. I know there's quite a bit of, skeptics of what really happened. I'm not quite sure.
I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but I think there's so many unanswered questions and all the mafia connections. I'm a believer in it.
We have seen so many conspiracy theories about the whole event. You watch a program, you believe it's possibly true, then you watch another program, you believe that might be true. I wonder whether we'll ever know in 100 years' time exactly what happened. The people that knew are no longer with us.
My first guest is a former British Army officer, an investigative writer, and a weapons expert. He's also a crack shot on conspiracy theories, and he's actually fired with a laser gun from the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza, where Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly carried out his earth-shattering crime. He's Michael Yardley. Michael, welcome. I suppose the first question is, and you're an expert, could Lee Harvey Oswald have carried out this extraordinarily successful assassination?
If we're being precise, yes, I think he could have. And I think you and I would also perhaps say that this was a terrible, grim day. It affected a lot of people. I can remember as a schoolboy in the States when it happened and the shadow it cast all over us. Now, yes, I think it is possible. Indeed, I think it probable from my own research and experiments. I've been to Dealey Plaza twice. I've had the Dallas police shut down Dealey Plaza so I could make experiments, measure angles, take simulated shots with a gun, an exact model of Oswald's gun with a laser in it. We also went to the levee in Dallas where Oswald allegedly practiced. We used an identical real gun to the one he had and ammunition from the same batch in a later test that he actually used. My own opinion is, yes, I believe with a 95% probability that he did shoot on the day. But he's a deeply suspicious character, and he could have been run knowingly or unknowingly as someone's agent.
Tell us just how suspicious.
Well, he was in the Marine Corps, but specifically he was a radar technician on the U-2 spy plane. I mean, this was the most secret thing in the world at the time. Then, allegedly, whilst he was in the Marine Corps, his hobbies were colloquial Russian. He developed an interest in Marxist-Leninism. He decides to leave the Marine Corps, where he actually had action taken against him for being insubordinate, for having an illegal weapon. He then decides he wants to not only leave the Marine Corps, but later leave America, renounce capitalism. He goes to Moscow via London and Helsinki, goes to the then Soviet authorities and says, I want to become a Soviet citizen. They tell him to go away. He goes to the US legation. They say, go away, you're mad. He goes back to the Soviet authorities, threatens suicide and ends up having psychiatric treatment and ends up, through a very convoluted process, in a sheet metal factory in Minsk, where he falls in love with and eventually marries a girl called Marina. He has a small child. Allegedly, he becomes disenchanted with Marxist-Leninism and returns to the States. Now, all sorts of conspiracy theories have been suggested. It's been suggested that the CIA turned him and wanted him to come back to the States. It's been suggested the KGB were in charge of a conspiracy, that the Cubans, the mafia, so many conspiracy theories. And you go onto YouTube, you see all these programs about it, and it's a fog. So I want to go back to the basics. And the basics are this. Yes, you can make those shots. It is possible. If you look at the Zapruder film, that's the 8mm amateur film, where you see this terrible shot of Jackie crawling backwards on the limo. You see the side of JFK's head come off. It's terrible footage. But if you look at it in slow-mo or freeze frame it, you see a plume of blood and bone going upwards and forwards on the final fatal shot. Now, let's be clear. There's some dispute about this, but most people agree now that there were 3 shots in about 7 seconds. The first shot from the 6th floor of the book depository, Oswald apparently missed. The vehicle was crossing below. It's the toughest shot technically. He would have had to have aimed in front of Kennedy to have hit him. But he didn't do that, and it seems he missed. The second shot was an oblique shot at something just over 60 yards. That's the one that hit Kennedy, went through Kennedy, and wounded Governor Connolly. And the final shot, the fatal shot, is the one that probably entered here, blew off the side of his head. Terrible thing. You can see it on that film, and then you see Jackie crawling back on the vehicle, horribly, I suspect, to retrieve part of her husband. It's a terrible business. Now, when we forensically and minutely, with unlimited resources, played this all through, we found out that we could mimic the exact effect of the Zapruder film with a shot, high and behind, very like the final fatal shot, and we got exactly the same sort of plume.
And this is at about 100 yards, the third shot?
Yes, just something over 90 yards.
Paradoxically, for most viewers, that's an easier shot than a closer up one.
Yes, because it doesn't need the forward allowance. You don't really need to aim off or not aim off much to make it. Now, the question has arisen, was Oswald a good enough shot? Well, he was an adequate shot. He was a Marine Corps sharpshooter. That means he was basically a trained rifleman. Now, when I did this, and I've done it 6 times or thereabouts, I connected with all 3 shots on every occasion. The weapon's not a particularly good weapon. It's average. The ammunition, however, 6.5, is an ideal assassination round, and the weapon he was using was a carbine, a short rifle, fairly easy to conceal. which, although it wasn't ideal, was adequate for the purpose.
In a way, I'm glad you haven't adopted the current zeitgeist, which is that a CIA man accidentally shot Kennedy with the fatal third shot, because I know that you're an equal expert on the assassination of Jack Kennedy's brother, Robert, in California in 1968, where I gather your thesis is that the bodyguard of Robert Kennedy may well have fired the fatal shot.
Allegedly, Sirhan, the Palestinian, came into the steam room of the Ambassador Hotel in LA, says, "Kennedy, you son of a," and starts firing with an 8-shot 2.2 revolver. Now, there are 10 to 14 bullet holes to be accounted for, but he had an 8-shot weapon and he did not reload. There must have been a second gunman. What we do know is that his uniformed security guard was in the habit of carrying a weapon of the same caliber as the murder weapon rather than his normal service issue 38. And it's quite possible that he had that with him that day. And my theory, but it's only a thesis, is that in the melee that developed between Sirhan and the other people in that room, that the security guard might have accidentally used RFK's body to shield himself and accidentally have shot RFK in the mastoid. So there's something wrong there, and I'm absolutely certain that there were 2 shots, and this is really the first time that in a big way this has ever been published.
Michael Yardley, an expert indeed. Thanks very much for appearing on
Very
Sputnik.
much, George.
Thanks
Pleasure
so
to be
much.
here.
Appreciate
Thanks for
it.
having me.
Now, after the break, I'll be interviewing the Right Honourable David Davis, PCMP, another sharpshooter on the inglorious impasse paralysing Whitehall over the inquiry into the Iraq War. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. The Chilcot inquiry into Britain's involvement in the disastrous invasion of Iraq began 4 whole years ago and heard its last witness 2 years ago, but since then, silence. The dogged Chilcot refuses to publish unless we can see what he's already seen of the telephone and other electronic traffic between former Prime Minister Tony Blair and George W. Bush. 10 Downing Street simply refuses and, under pressure, blames the White House for its refusal.
I went down to Edgware Road in London, a mainly Arab area, and I asked the people there how they feel about the refusal.
Well, let's take a look.
Even if they put it published, well, they remove the most important keys maybe without being anybody knows. And even if the public knows now, everything has gone 10 years now.
They're lying about everything, because I think, it's like a game they play as they doing with us in Egypt as well, because I don't think they care about the people, they care about themselves.
We can't find the truth, no way. It's difficult to find the truth. It means to take America to the court. That's all for war against this. It's not allowed.
Our next guest, the Right Honourable David Davis, PC MP, almost was the leader of the Conservative Party. If he had been, I'd be sitting here now interviewing him in Downing Street. They chose the wrong man, alas, but he's still a real power in the land and a power in Parliament, which explains why he's got this fantastic office by the River Thames. I wanted to talk to him about the impasse over the Chilcot inquiry. David Davis, thanks for joining us on Sputnik. I described the membership of the Chilcot inquiry as a parade of establishment flunkies who were likely to throw the case against the Blair and Brown governments on the war. It seems I may have been wrong. They've stuck at their task quite doggedly, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And Chilcot, I mean, you might have had some reason because he's been involved in all the establishment inquiries down the years. And he's been a very trusted man by the British establishment. But he's been very honest and determined about this. And I think it's determination, actually, that counts more than anything else. So, yeah, I think when they eventually get it published, it will be a humdinger of a report. But there's a big question mark over the when.
For all the great achievements that you have, you're not really a part of the British establishment, but you know it. So why is the establishment proving so difficult over the issue of the documents that Chilcot says he needs before he can publish. After all, this is deeply embarrassing to set up a £7 million public inquiry and then have it unable to publish its report because of what will be seen in the country and the world as a cover-up.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when you started out down the route of having an inquiry like this, it is assumed they will see all of the secret information and publish that which they think is necessary. The whole point of having someone like Chilcot in charge of the inquiry is he is the sort of person you think the establishment would trust to make decisions on what ought to be able to be put in the public domain. So it's an assumption right at the beginning that you can publish things that affected the decision on the war. And that includes things like conversations between Tony Blair and his cabinet, between the various ministers, between Tony Blair and the Allies, most notably George Bush. So those were all written into the remit on day one. So what's happened is all of a sudden the various members of the establishment, for different reasons I think, are hiding behind a whole series of conventions which, whilst they normally apply, shouldn't apply to an inquiry into a war.
The permanent secretary, who is, in the name of the cabinet, one presumes, blocking the release of these documents in the report, was, of course, the right-hand man of Mr. Blair at the time of the war. Is he covering up for Mr. Blair or covering up for himself?
Or is he just exercising some sympathy for people he was near at the time? We actually don't know. But the simple truth is that under normal circumstances of the British government, someone like that would be excluded from the decision. You know, if you're a minister and somebody brings you a decision which relates to your personal interest, you give it to somebody else to make the decision. You don't make it yourself. You don't, you know, let's say I had a farm and there was a decision made about my farm, I wouldn't be allowed to make it. I'd get somebody else to do it. And this is more than a farm, this is the whole farm that Hayward is making this decision over. So he shouldn't be allowed to make the decision. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, the rules he's using. He's talking about, you know, we can't expose conversations between heads of government and so on. Well, if you're not going to expose those rules, why did you start this in the first place? Because you cannot understand why a war starts unless you hear the views of the decision makers. So you've got both the motive, the man, and the excuse all wrong. Every single part of this is wrong.
Now, you've got your ear pretty close to the ground. What do you think's in the correspondence and the record of telephone calls that are being refused?
Well, I don't know what's in, but what I do know is the questions they have to answer and why they're sensitive. I mean, firstly, did Tony Blair give undertakings before he came to Parliament? In other words, did he commit Britain before Parliament had its say? Because in this day and age, as you and I took a part in over the Syrian episode, in this day and age, Parliament is now accepted, has to decide not on wars that are reactions to being invaded, but discretionary wars, wars that you decide on, has to be done via Parliament. Now, if Blair made the decision beforehand, that's acutely embarrassing, both for Blair and his whole government, and of course for the Americans. Secondly,
well, just before you go on, that would mean that they had lied to the House, of course.
Yeah, well,
which is a hanging offence.
In this place, it's a hanging offence.
Yes.
Metaphorically speaking.
Yes. Yes, we don't do hanging in Britain anymore.
I know the killing of Tony Blair is an interest to you, but so metaphorically, that is a hanging offence. Secondly, of course, there's the other possible lie to the House, which is the basis of the evidence, what is now known in Britain as the dodgy dossier, the intelligence reports which are put together in a sort of glossed up pamphlet, implying that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, which were a threat to Britain. I mean, there was this idea of he could marshal them at 45 minutes' notice, so considerable.
And hit our bases in Cyprus.
And hit our bases and so on. So all of those things, but there are two lies straight away, you know. Then there are questions of the actual execution of the war. I mean, I know from my own experience and contacts around the British military establishment that in the run-up to the war, there were serious concerns amongst the British officer class, if you like, about how we were proposing to deal with the day after the conflict. You know, what was going to happen to the rebuilding of Iraq? What was going to happen to the government of Iraq? What was going to happen to make sure that the Iraqi people did not suffer, as in fact they ended up suffering, the huge post-war traumas? Now, that was an area where clearly some decisions must, or well, should have been made, and one presumes must have been made. How were those decisions made? How did we go into a war without knowing what the outcome would be? So there's a whole series of very, very embarrassing questions to answer. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I suspect, since we've run into this brick wall, I suspect they're not the ones that Mr. Blair would like to see.
Now, you are a former military man. You are a former minister in the Foreign Office. You have occupied commanding heights in British government, and you're still a pretty heavyweight senior guy. How, therefore, would you calibrate? How would you describe the scale of the foreign policy disaster, in my view, and in the view of the great majority of people, the invasion and occupation of Iraq?
It's one of the biggest post-war disasters. I mean, I voted for it. Let's understand this right up front. I voted for it because I was told, and I believed the Prime Minister today, one assumes the Prime Minister doesn't lie to the House of Commons, that this was a strategic necessity, that it was a threat that we had to deal with. We were lied to on that. I'm quite sure that was not true. So it's a massive mistake, and it's coloured all sorts of things. It's coloured our entire relationship with the Muslim world and the Middle East. It's destabilised an important part, a massively important part of the Middle East. It's caused, most of all, it's caused huge numbers of deaths, and all those things, and to no real purpose. I mean, there is a mild purpose, but not a purpose that justifies that sort of wide-scale killing. So it's a major mistake, much worse than Suez, which was viewed as a huge strategic error previous that led to the fall of the Prime Minister and resignation of Prime Minister. So a huge mistake, and one which will colour British foreign policy, and I think American foreign policy, for a very, very long time into the future.
Killed something else too, didn't it? It killed the essential credibility of the political class in Britain and in the United States. Since Iraq, very few people believe what they're told officially. Claude Cockburn in the 1930s once said that nothing is true until it's been officially denied. Nowadays, most people don't really believe, and this is not a party point, I know you're a conservative, but nobody, again, there'll be no glad, confident morning again.
Yeah, there's always been a healthy suspicion in Britain of the political class, and I rather approve of that, frankly. But it's killed even the political class's own belief in itself. I mean, again, to come back to the Syrian debate, which we both took part in, one of the reasons that our side, the anti-war side, won was because nobody was willing to take on trust a simple statement from the government that this was necessary. You know,
the cloud of Iraq hung over that whole debate in which we participated.
It completely coloured the whole debate, and as a result, we decided, in my view, the right decision. We decided not to do anything, and indeed, actually, for Britain not to legitimise an American assault, which is what it was really about. And truthfully, actually, our involvement in Iraq, I know we committed soldiers, and I know we had hundreds of deaths. And we had some material defeats as well in terms of our military strategy. But what we were doing was legitimising an American attack. And I think that whole concept of Britain being the people who say, well, this isn't just a bit of American imperialism, this is a really necessary action, has gone, completely gone.
David Davis, thanks for joining us on Sputnik.
My pleasure.
Wow. They'll certainly be watching that interview more than once in Downing Street this weekend. Now, this is the point in the show where we listen to your voices. Gayatri, what's hot on the internet?
A lot of people have, of course, sent us congratulations for our very first show last week. They liked the guest, they liked the debate, they liked your jacket, and they liked the set.
So, did they like what we had to say?
Yes, well done, very much. Edmond Dante says, for example, the new show Sputnik is a breath of reality in a world of misinformation. Can't wait to see more. Good. Thanks, RT. Excellent. People also tweeted us about the JFK assassinations, and they were overwhelmingly skeptic. Lana Del Ney, he says because they are guilty of war crimes and they know it, they're desperately ducking for cover. Jonathan Smith, in my opinion, Oswald wasn't involved in the shooting. He was the patsy. Was right-wing conspiracy to murder a liberal president.
Well, unfortunately, that's it for this week. But remember...
Keep in touch with us on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, it's been marvellous.